Everyone warned me that protecting yourself from family is the cruelest thing a person can do. They were wrong. The cruelest thing is not protecting yourself at all. I need you to understand something before we go any further. I was not a suspicious child. I was not the kind of teenager who read legal documents under flashlights or called attorneys from the school bathroom. I was the kind of kid who believed, with embarrassing sincerity, that the people who kissed your forehead at night were the same people who would never, under any imaginable circumstance, reach into your chest and rip out whatever was warm inside you. I believed that until I was 17 years, 364 days old. And then I stopped believing it, permanently, on the night before my 18th birthday, when I found the envelope. The envelope was ivory-colored, the kind that announces itself without trying. It had been slipped under the door of my grandfather Osvaldo's old study, a room that technically belonged to no one anymore, since Osvaldo had died 14 months prior and left behind a house full of furniture that smelled like cedar and a will that left everything to me. Not to my mother, Cirilda, not to my uncle Breton, not to the extended constellation of cousins who showed up every 2 years at holidays with their mouths shaped like generosity, but their eyes shaped like calculation. To me. Exclusively, stubbornly, deliberately to me. I found the envelope because I couldn't sleep. I had this habit, when the insomnia came, of walking to Osvaldo's study and sitting in his reading chair, the one upholstered in green leather that had faded to the color of a winter lake. I'd sit there in the dark and let the silence of the room press against me like something solid. It was the only place in that house where I felt like I could breathe without being watched. The envelope had no name on the outside. I held it for what felt like a long time before I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, written in a handwriting I didn't immediately recognize because it was trying very hard not to be recognized. The handwriting was my mother's. I knew it the way you know a smell, not by thinking about it, but by something older than thought. The note said, "We've been patient. The attorney says the transfer window opens at 18. Make sure you're present. Don't let him make decisions without us in the room." Him was me. I was him. I was the decision that needed to be prevented. I sat in that green chair for 4 hours. The house made its sounds, the pipes, the settling, the low hum of the refrigerator 2 floors below, and I sat very still while something inside me rearranged itself into a shape I'd never worn before. I wasn't angry, exactly. Anger requires surprise. What I felt was closer to the sensation of finally seeing the seam in a piece of fabric that had always been there, the line where the 2 pieces were stitched together, the place where the illusion ended and the construction began. By the time the house started to lighten, I knew what I needed to do. I just had no idea if I could actually do it in time. I need to pause here and explain something about Osvaldo, because nothing that follows makes sense without him. My grandfather was a man who had built his entire fortune, not enormous by the standards of people who discuss fortunes as a hobby, but significant, real, the kind that could change the trajectory of a family for 3 generations, by operating on a principle that most of the people around him found either incomprehensible or offensive. The principle was this: trust the structure, not the person. He didn't mean this cynically. He meant it architecturally. He believed that good intentions were the most unreliable building material in existence, and that any system designed around the goodness of people would eventually collapse, because people were not reliable structures. They were weather, unpredictable, shifting, capable of catastrophic change without warning. He had built his life around legal structures, contractual obligations, entities and instruments that functioned regardless of what any individual happened to feel on any given day. He'd tried to teach my mother this. He'd tried to teach Breton. Neither of them had been interested. What they'd been interested in, I understand now, was the outcome of his structures without the inconvenience of his philosophy. When he died, he left me not just the money, but a letter that I'd read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. In the letter, he told me about a man named Ezekiel Vorn, an estate attorney he'd worked with for 11 years, who kept an office above a jewelry repair shop in a part of the city that still had payphones on the corners. He said, "Find Ezekiel before anything finds you. He knows what to do. He has been waiting." I had not yet called Ezekiel Vorn. I had been, in the 14 months since Osvaldo's death, operating in a kind of suspended animation, going to school, coming home, watching my mother move through the house with the specific energy of someone waiting for a lock to click open. I'd told myself I was being paranoid. I'd told myself that the note I found was a coincidence, or that I'd misread it, or that it meant something more innocent than what it obviously meant. The note under the door ended my self-deception. At 6:47 in the morning, while the sky was still the color of a bruise healing, I took Osvaldo's old address book from the locked drawer of his desk. I'd had the key since the reading of the will, and I found the number for Ezekiel Vorn. I called it from the landline in the study because my hands were shaking too much to trust myself with a cell phone, and I stood there in the half-dark listening to it ring. He picked up on the third ring. He said, "I wondered when you'd call." His voice was the kind of voice that has been around long enough to be unsurprised by most things, a voice like old wood, dense and unhurried. I told him I'd found a note. I told him my birthday was today. I told him I needed to know what could be done and how fast it could be done. He said, "Come to the office. Come now. I'll have coffee." I left the house before 7. I told no one. I walked 6 blocks to the transit stop and took the first train downtown. And I sat in the gray morning light watching the city slide past the windows, and I felt, for the first time in 14 months, like I was moving instead of waiting. Ezekiel Vorn's office was exactly as my grandfather had described it. Above a jewelry repair shop whose window displayed a handwritten card that said, "Watches fixed while you wait," though the shop didn't open for another 3 hours. There was a narrow staircase with a brass banister that had been polished so many times it had a softness to it, like something worn smooth by decades of worried hands. I climbed the stairs and knocked. He was a small man, which surprised me. I had imagined someone larger based on the voice. He had the kind of face that age improves, not by smoothing anything, but by organizing it, the way a long winter organizes a landscape. He shook my hand and he looked at me for a moment without speaking. And then he said, "You look like him." I knew he meant Osvaldo. I said, "Is that good?" He said, "Remains to be seen. Sit down." For the next 2 hours, Ezekiel Vorn explained to me exactly what Osvaldo had set in motion. Not just the inheritance itself, but the architecture surrounding it. The inheritance was held in a revocable trust, which meant that until I formally acted upon it, it remained theoretically adjustable. What Osvaldo had anticipated, had apparently explained to Ezekiel in precise detail during a meeting 3 years before his death, was that the period between my 18th birthday and my first formal engagement with the inherited assets would be the period of maximum vulnerability. The window when someone with the right combination of legal standing and family relationship might attempt to intervene. Ezekiel said, "He was very specific about your mother." I said, "What did he say?" Ezekiel looked at me the way a doctor looks at you when they're deciding how much information you can hold. He said she had never forgiven him for choosing you, and that she would not begin forgiving you on your birthday. He said she was his greatest failure as a parent and his greatest education as a person, and that the best thing he could do for you was ensure that she never had legal access to anything you owned. I asked what we needed to do. He slid a folder across the desk. The folder was thick, organized with tabs, the kind of document preparation that signals someone has been doing a job for a very long time. He said, "We convert the revocable trust to an irrevocable trust. Today. Before you speak to anyone, before you go home, before you answer any calls. An irrevocable trust cannot be undone by you, by her, or by anyone except the courts under extreme circumstances. The assets go in, The door closes, and the only person who benefits from those assets for the next however many years is the beneficiary, which is you. I asked if there was a catch. He said, "The catch is that it's permanent. You cannot change your mind. You cannot reclaim the assets on a whim. You cannot dissolve the trust because you've decided you want a different structure." The irrevocability goes both ways. It protects you from her, and it protects the trust from you. I said, "I understand." He looked at me again, that same measuring look. He said, "Your grandfather said you'd say that. He said you'd understand faster than he did." I signed the documents at 9:14 in the morning on my 18th birthday. Ezekiel had two witnesses, his assistant, a tall woman named Quilla who wore reading glasses on a chain of amber beads, and a notary who smelled like the cedar pencils from elementary school and who stamped everything with the specific satisfaction of someone who has found the exact right job for themselves. The signing took less than 20 minutes. The legal transformation it represented would take the rest of my life to fully comprehend. I left Ezekiel's office at 9:42. I took the train home. I sat in my seat and watched the city reverse itself outside the window, the same streets in the opposite direction. And I felt something I can only describe as the absence of a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was the particular relief of having made a decision that cannot be unmade, of having chosen permanence deliberately in a world that offers very few permanent things. I got home at 10:23. My mother was in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, wearing the gray cardigan she always wore on weekend mornings. And she turned when I came in, and she smiled, the smile she did, the one that used all the right muscles but originated somewhere cold. And she said, "Happy birthday. We need to talk about that money." My blood did something I can only describe as running cold, though I understand now that what I was experiencing was not fear, but recognition. The recognition that I had been right, that the note was what it appeared to be, that the months of watching and waiting and almost convincing myself into a more comfortable interpretation had been months of willful delay in the face of something obvious. I said, "Sure." She gestured to the kitchen table. She had, I noticed, already set 2 mugs out. She had been planning this conversation, had set the stage for it while I was gone, had arranged the domestic props that signal an intimate, reasonable discussion. I sat down. She sat across from me. She put her hands around her mug the way people do when they want to appear unthreatening. She said, "Breton and I have been talking. We think there are some things Osvaldo didn't understand about tax exposure, about asset protection, about the right kind of structures for someone your age. We've spoken to some people. There's a way to consolidate things, to protect the estate, and frankly, to protect you, that would involve..." I said, "It's already done." She stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something, 2 short barks and then silence. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "The trust is irrevocable as of this morning. The assets are locked. There's nothing to consolidate, nothing to restructure, nothing to discuss." The temperature in the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. I watched my mother's face do something complicated. Not rage, not immediately, but something that preceded rage, a kind of interior reorganization, the rearrangement of a plan that had been counted on. She set her mug down. She said, "Who did you talk to?" I said, "Ezekiel Vorn." She said his name back to me like it tasted like something she'd been expecting to find at the bottom of a glass. She said, "Of course." We sat there for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then she said, "Your grandfather has controlled everything, even from the grave." I said, "He protected me. There's a difference." She said, "You don't know what you've done." I said, "I know exactly what I've done." What I didn't say, because some truths are too large for the moment that contains them, was this. I had done the thing my grandfather had spent decades trying to teach everyone around him to do, and that almost no one had been willing to do, because it required accepting something that most people spend their whole lives refusing to accept: that love and interest are not the same thing, that warmth is not the same as safety, and that the people closest to you are not exempt from the rules that govern all human behavior, that the structure matters more than the sentiment, that if you build your security on the goodness of any single person, you have built on weather. Osvaldo had tried to explain this to my mother. He'd tried to explain it to Breton. He had spent decades watching the people he loved refuse the one protection he could offer them, choosing instead the comfort of believing they were immune to the very human conditions that he knew from long experience made protection necessary in the first place. He couldn't make them listen, but he could leave me a key to a locked drawer and the name of a man above a jewelry shop, and 14 months to find my way to both. In the weeks after my birthday, the conversations with my mother and Breton became a particular kind of terrible. Not explosive, because there was nothing left to explode, but grinding, persistent, a slow campaign of pressure and renegotiation that assumed I would eventually find the irrevocability inconvenient enough to seek a legal remedy. They didn't understand, and I could not make them understand, that I had chosen the inconvenience deliberately. That the thing that made the structure valuable was precisely the thing they were asking me to undo. Breton called me 4 times in the first week. He used, in sequence, the following approaches: appeal to family loyalty, appeal to financial logic, appeal to my sympathy for my mother's circumstances, and finally, a version of gentle threat that he seemed to believe was indistinguishable from advice. I listened to each call in its entirety. I said very little. At the end of the 4th call, I told him I was busy, and I stopped answering his calls. My mother tried a different strategy. She became, for about 3 weeks, unusually attentive, cooking things I'd mentioned liking, asking about my friends, showing up at the door of my room with the particular energy of someone performing closeness. I watched this happen with a kind of exhausted clarity, the way you watch a magic trick when you already know how it's done. Not because I didn't love her. I did, and do, in the complicated way you love someone who has taught you, through their own behavior, exactly what love is not. But because I had made my decision, and the decision was not reversible, and no amount of performed warmth was going to change the fact of a sealed legal instrument. Eventually, she stopped. Eventually, the house settled into a different kind of arrangement. Not hostile, exactly, but honest in a way it had never been before. The performance ended because the performance had no purpose anymore. What remained was something starker and, in a strange way, more comfortable than anything that had preceded it. We were 2 people sharing a house who understood clearly, for the first time, what we each wanted and what we could and could not take from each other. I have thought, many times in the years since, about what would have happened if I had not walked to Osvaldo's study that night, if I had slept, if I had found the note a week later, or a month later, or never. If I had gone into my birthday without the information, walked into that kitchen, sat down across from my mother, and entered the conversation she had prepared for me without knowing that I was entering it, without the context, without Ezekiel's number, without 14 months of a locked drawer waiting to be opened. I think about this not because I'm afraid of the alternate version, but because it taught me the most important thing I know about protection. It is almost always accomplished one day earlier than it feels necessary. The moment that feels like paranoia is usually the moment that matters. The structure you build when nothing seems wrong is the structure that holds when everything goes wrong. My grandfather understood this. He built his whole life around it. He tried to give it to the people he loved, and most of them refused it. And then he found one person, a kid who sat in his green chair in the dark and read his old books and felt at home in the silence of his study. And he left everything to that person. And he left that person a key. And he left a man waiting above a jewelry shop. I was 18 years old and I sat in a notary's office and I signed something irrevocable. And it was the most permanent decision of my life. And I have never once, not for a single hour, wanted to undo it. Some doors, when you close them, are supposed to stay closed. Some structures are built to outlast the weather. Some trusts are worth keeping. If this story hit something in you, like subscribe, you won't regret staying.